Book 1, Chapter 4 of This Side of Paradise. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Book 1, Chapter 4, Narcissus Off Duty. During Princeton's transition period, that is, during Amory's last 2 years there, while he saw it change and broaden and live up to its Gothic beauty by better means than night parades, certain individuals arrived who stirred it to its plethoric heights. Some of them had been freshmen, and wild freshmen, with Amory. Some were in the class below, and it was in the beginning of his last year and around small tables at the Nassau Inn that they began questioning aloud the institutions that Amory and countless others before him had questioned so long in secret. First, and partly by accident, they struck on certain books, a definite type of biographical novel that Amory christened quest books. In the quest book the hero set off in life armed with the best weapons, and avowedly intending to use them as such weapons are usually used, to push their possessors ahead as selfishly and blindly as possible. But the heroes of the quest books discovered that there might be a more magnificent use for them. None Other Gods, Sinister Street, and The Research Magnificent were examples of such books. It was the latter of these three that gripped Bern Holiday and made him wonder in the beginning of senior year how much it was worth while being a diplomatic autocrat around his club on Prospect Avenue and basking in the highlights of class office. It was distinctly through the channels of aristocracy that Bern found his way. Amory, through Carey, had had a vague drifting acquaintance with him, but not until January of senior year did their friendship commence. "Heard the latest?" said Tom, coming in late one drizzly evening with that triumphant air he always wore after a successful conversational bout. "No. Somebody flunked out? Or another ship sunk?" "Worse than that. About 1/3 of the junior class are going to resign from their clubs." "What?" "Actual fact." "Why?" "Spirit of reform and all that. Bern Holiday is behind it. The club presidents are holding a meeting tonight to see if they can find a joint means of combating it." "Well, what's the idea of the thing?" "Oh, club's injurious to Princeton democracy. Cost a lot. Draw social lines. Take time. The regular line you get sometimes from disappointed sophomores. Woodrow thought they should be abolished, and all that." "But this is the real thing?" "Absolutely. I think it'll go through." "For Pete's sake, tell me more about it." "Well," began Tom, "it seems that the idea developed simultaneously in several heads. I was talking to Bern a while ago, and he claims that it's a logical result if an intelligent person thinks long enough about the social system. They had a discussion crowd, and the point of abolishing the clubs was brought up by someone. Everybody there leaped at it. It had been in each one's mind, more or less, and it just needed a spark to bring it out." "Fine. I swear I think it'll be most entertaining. How did they feel up at Cap and Gown?" "Wild, of course. Everyone's been sitting and arguing and swearing and getting mad and getting sentimental and getting brutal. It's the same at all the clubs. I've been the rounds. They get one of the radicals in the corner and fire questions at him." "How do the radicals stand up?" "Oh, moderately well. Bern's a damn good talker, and so obviously sincere that you can't get anywhere with him. It's so evident that resigning from his club means so much more to him than preventing it does to us that I felt futile when I argued. Finally took a position that was brilliantly neutral. In fact, I believe Bern thought for a while that he'd converted me." "And you say almost 1/3 of the junior class are going to resign?" "Call it 1/4 and be safe." "Lord, who'd have thought it possible?" There was a brisk knock at the door, and Bern himself came in. "Hello, Amory. Hello, Tom." Amory rose. "Evening, Bern. Don't mind if I seem to rush. I'm going to Renwick's." Byrne turned to him quickly. "You probably know what I want to talk to Tom about, and it isn't a bit private. I wish you'd stay." "I'd be glad to." Amory sat down again, and as Byrne perched on a table and launched into argument with Tom, he looked at this revolutionary more carefully than he ever had before. Broad-browed and strong-chinned, with a fineness in the honest gray eyes that were like Carey's, Byrne was a man who gave an immediate impression of bigness and security. Stubborn, that was evident, but his stubbornness wore no stolidity, and when he had talked for 5 minutes, Amory knew that this keen enthusiasm had in it no quality of dilettantism. The intense power Amory felt later in Byrne Holiday differed from the admiration he had had for Humbird. This time it began as purely a mental interest. With other men of whom he had thought as primarily first class, he had been attracted first by their personalities, and in Byrne he missed that immediate magnetism to which he usually swore allegiance. But that night Amory was struck by Byrne's intense earnestness, a quality he was accustomed to associate only with the dread stupidity, and by the great enthusiasm that struck dead chords in his heart. Byrne stood vaguely for a land Amory hoped he was drifting toward, and it was almost time that land was in sight. Tom and Amory and Alec had reached an impasse. Never did they seem to have new experiences in common, for Tom and Alec had been as blindly busy with their committees and boards as Amory had been blindly idling, and the things they had for dissection college, contemporary personality, and the like they had hashed and rehashed for many a frugal conversational meal. That night they discussed the clubs until 12, and in the main they agreed with Byrne. To the roommates it did not seem such a vital subject as it had in the 2 years before, but the logic of Byrne's objections to the social system dovetailed so completely with everything they had thought that they questioned rather than argued, and envied the sanity that enabled this man to stand out so against all traditions. Then Amory branched off and found that Byrne was deep in other things as well. Economics had interested him, and he was turning socialist. Pacifism played in the back of his mind, and he read The Masses and Lyov Tolstoy faithfully. "How about religion?" Amory asked him. "Don't know. I'm in a muddle about a lot of things. I've just discovered that I've a mind, and I'm starting to read." "Read what?" "Everything. I have to pick and choose, of course, but mostly things to make me think. I'm reading the Four Gospels now, and the varieties of religious experience." "What chiefly started you?" "Wells, I guess, and Tolstoy, and a man named Edward Carpenter. I've been reading for over a year now, on a few lines, on what I consider the essential lines." "Poetry?" "Well, frankly, not what you call poetry, or for your reasons. You two write, of course, and look at things differently. Whitman is the man that attracts me." "Whitman?" "Yes, he's a definite ethical force." "Well, I'm ashamed to say that I'm a blank on the subject of Whitman. How about you, Tom?" Tom nodded sheepishly. "Well," continued Byrne, "you may strike a few poems that are tiresome, but I mean the mass of his work. He's tremendous, like Tolstoy. They both look things in the face, and somehow, different as they are, stand for somewhat the same things." "You have me stumped, Byrne," Amory admitted. "I've read Anna Karenina and the Kreutzer Sonata, of course, but Tolstoy is mostly in the original Russian as far as I'm concerned." "He's the greatest man in hundreds of years!" cried Byrne enthusiastically. "Did you ever see a picture of that shaggy old head of his?" They talked until 3, from biology to organized religion, and when Amory crept shivering into bed it was with his mind aglow with ideas and a sense of shock that someone else had discovered the path he might have followed. Byrne Holiday was so evidently developing, and Amory had considered that he was doing the same. He had fallen into a deep cynicism over what had crossed his path, plotted the imperfectibility of man, and read Shaw and Chesterton enough to keep his mind from the edges of decadence. Now suddenly all his mental processes of the last year and a half seemed stale and futile. A petty consummation of himself. and like a sombre background lay that incident of the spring before, that filled half his nights with a dreary terror and made him unable to pray. He was not even a Catholic, yet that was the only ghost of a code that he had, the gaudy, ritualistic, paradoxical Catholicism whose prophet was Chesterton, whose claqueurs were such reformed rakes of literature as Huysmans and Bourget, whose American sponsor was Ralph Adams Cram, with his adulation of 13th-century cathedrals, a Catholicism which Amory found convenient and ready-made, without priest or sacraments or sacrifice. He could not sleep, so he turned on his reading lamp and, taking down the Kreutzer Sonata, searched it carefully for the germs of Burns' enthusiasm. Being Burn was suddenly so much realer than being clever. Yet he sighed. Here were other possible clay feet. He thought back through 2 years, of Burn as a hurried, nervous freshman, quite submerged in his brother's personality. Then he remembered an incident of sophomore year, in which Burn had been suspected of the leading role. Dean Hollister had been heard by a large group arguing with a taxi driver, who had driven him from the junction. In the course of the altercation the dean remarked that he might as well buy the taxicab. He paid and walked off, but next morning he entered his private office to find the taxicab itself in the space usually occupied by his desk, bearing a sign which read, "Property of Dean Hollister, bought and paid for." It took 2 expert mechanics half a day to disassemble it into its minutest parts and remove it, which only goes to prove the rare energy of sophomore humour under efficient leadership. Then again, that very fall, Burn had caused a sensation. A certain Phyllis Stiles, an intercollegiate prom-trotter, had failed to get her yearly invitation to the Harvard-Princeton game. Jessie Ferrenby had brought her to a smaller game a few weeks before, and had pressed Burn into service, to the ruination of the latter's misogyny. "Are you coming to the Harvard game?" Burn had asked indiscreetly, merely to make conversation. "If you ask me," cried Phyllis quickly. "Of course I do," said Burn feebly. He was unversed in the arts of Phyllis, and was sure that this was merely a vapid form of kidding. Before an hour had passed he knew that he was indeed involved. Phyllis had pinned him down and served him up, informed him the train she was arriving by, and depressed him thoroughly. Aside from loathing Phyllis, he had particularly wanted to stag that game and entertain some Harvard friends. "She'll see," he informed a delegation who arrived in his room to josh him. "This will be the last game she ever persuades any young innocent to take her to." "But, Burn, why did you invite her if you didn't want her?" "Burn, you know you're secretly mad about her. That's the real trouble." "What can you do, Burn? What can you do against Phyllis?" But Burn only shook his head and muttered threats which consisted largely of the phrase, "She'll see, she'll see." The blithesome Phyllis bore her 25 summers gaily from the train, but on the platform a ghastly sight met her eyes. There were Burn and Fred Sloane arrayed to the last dot, like the lurid figures on college posters. They had bought flaring suits with huge peg-top trousers and gigantic padded shoulders. On their heads were rakish college hats, pinned up in front and sporting bright orange and black bands, while from their celluloid collars blossomed flaming orange ties. They wore black armbands with orange peas, and carried canes flying Princeton pennants, the effect completed by socks and peeping handkerchiefs in the same color motifs. On a clanking chain they led a large, angry tomcat, painted to represent a tiger. A good half of the station crowd was already staring at them, torn between horrified pity and riotous mirth, and as Phyllis, with her svelte jaw dropping, approached, the pair bent over and emitted a college cheer in loud, far-carrying voices, thoughtfully adding the name Phyllis to the end. She was vociferously greeted and escorted enthusiastically across the campus, followed by half a hundred village urchins, to the stifled laughter of hundreds of alumni and visitors, half of whom had no idea that this was a practical joke, but thought that Byrne and Fred were two varsity sports showing their girl a collegiate time. Phyllis's feelings as she was paraded by the Harvard and Princeton stands, where sat dozens of her former devotees, can be imagined. She tried to walk a little ahead, she tried to walk a little behind, but they stayed close, that there should be no doubt whom she was with, talking in loud voices of their friends on the football team, until she could almost hear her acquaintances whispering, "Phyllis Styles must be awfully hard up to have come with those two." That had been Byrne, dynamically humorous, fundamentally serious. From that root had blossomed the energy that he was now trying to orient with progress. So the weeks passed, and March came, and the clay feet that Amory looked for failed to appear. About 100 juniors and seniors resigned from their clubs in a final fury of righteousness, and the clubs in helplessness turned upon Byrne their finest weapon, ridicule. Every one who knew him liked him, but what he stood for, and he began to stand for more all the time, came under the lash of many tongues, until a frailer man than he would have been snowed under. "Don't you mind losing prestige?" asked Amory one night. They had taken to exchanging calls several times a week. "Of course I don't. What's prestige, at best?" "Some people say that you're just a rather original politician." He roared with laughter. "That's what Fred Sloane told me to day. I suppose I have it coming." One afternoon they dipped into a subject that had interested Amory for a long time, the matter of the bearing of physical attributes on a man's make-up. Byrne had gone into the biology of this, and then, "Of course health counts. A healthy man has twice the chance of being good," he said. "I don't agree with you. I don't believe in muscular Christianity." "I do. I believe Christ had great physical vigor." "Oh, no," Amory protested. "He worked too hard for that. I imagine that when he died he was a broken-down man, and the great saints haven't been strong." "Half of them have." "Well, even granting that, I don't think health has anything to do with goodness. Of course it's valuable to a great saint to be able to stand enormous strains, but this fad of popular preachers rising on their toes in simulated virility, bellowing that calisthenics will save the world, no, Byrne, I can't go that." "Well, let's waive it. We won't get anywhere, and besides I haven't quite made up my mind about it myself. Now here's something I do know. Personal appearance has a lot to do with it." "Coloring?" Amory asked eagerly. "Yes." "That's what Tom and I figured," Amory agreed. "We took the yearbooks for the last 10 years and looked at the pictures of the senior council. I know you don't think much of that august body, but it does represent success here in a general way. Well, I suppose only about 35% of every class here are blondes, are really light, yet 2/3 of every senior council are light. We looked at pictures of 10 years of them, mind you. That means that out of every 15 light-haired men in the senior class, 1 is on the senior council, and of the dark-haired men it's only 1 in 50. "It's true," Byrne agreed. "The light-haired man is a higher type, generally speaking. I worked the thing out with the presidents of the United States once, and found that way over half of them were light-haired. Yet think of the preponderant number of brunettes in the race." "People unconsciously admit it," said Amory. "You'll notice a blond person is expected to talk. If a blond girl doesn't talk, we call her a doll. If a light-haired man is silent, he's considered stupid. Yet the world is full of dark, silent men, and languorous brunettes, who haven't a brain in their heads, and somehow are never accused of the dearth." "And the large mouth and broad chin and rather big nose undoubtedly make the superior face." "I'm not so sure." Amory was all for classical features. "Oh, yes, I'll show you." And Byrne pulled out of his desk a photographic collection of heavily bearded, shaggy celebrities, Tolstoy, Whitman, Carpenter, and others. "Aren't they wonderful?" Amory tried politely to appreciate them, and gave up laughingly. Bern, I think they're the ugliest looking crowd I ever came across. They look like an old man's home. Oh, Amory, look at that forehead on Emerson. Look at Tolstoy's eyes. His tone was reproachful. Amory shook his head. No, call them remarkable looking or anything you want, but ugly they certainly are. Unabashed, Byrne ran his hand lovingly across the spacious foreheads, and piling up the pictures put them back in his desk. Walking at night was one of his favorite pursuits, and one night he persuaded Amory to accompany him. I hate the dark, Amory objected. I didn't used to, except when I was particularly imaginative, but now I really do. I'm a regular fool about it. That's useless, you know. Quite possibly. We'll go east, Byrne suggested, and down that string of roads through the woods. Doesn't sound very appealing to me, admitted Amory reluctantly. But let's go. They set off at a good gait, and for an hour swung along in a brisk argument until the lights of Princeton were luminous white blots behind them. Any person with any imagination is bound to be afraid, said Byrne earnestly, and this very walking at night is one of the things I was afraid about. I'm going to tell you why I can walk anywhere now and not be afraid. Go on, Amory urged eagerly. They were striding toward the woods, Byrne's nervous, enthusiastic voice warming to his subject. I used to come out here alone at night, 3 months ago, and I always stopped at that crossroad we just passed. There were the woods looming up ahead, just as they do now. There were dogs howling, and the shadows, and no human sound. Of course I peopled the woods with everything ghastly, just like you do, don't you? I do, Amory admitted. Well, I began analyzing it. My imagination persisted in sticking horrors into the dark. So I stuck my imagination into the dark instead and let it look out at me. I let it play stray dog or escaped convict or ghost, and then saw myself coming along the road. That made it all right, as it always makes everything all right to project yourself completely into another's place. I knew that if I were the dog or the convict or the ghost, I wouldn't be a menace to Byrne Holiday any more than he was a menace to me. Then I thought of my watch. I'd better go back and leave it, and then essay the woods. No, I decided, it's better on the whole that I should lose a watch than that I should turn back. And I did go into them. Not only followed the road through them, but walked into them until I wasn't frightened any more. Did it until one night I sat down and dozed off in there. Then I knew I was through being afraid of the dark. Lordy, Amory breathed. I couldn't have done that. I'd have come out halfway, and the first time an automobile passed and made the dark thicker when its lamps disappeared, I'd have come in. Well, Byrne said suddenly, after a few moments' silence, we're halfway through. Let's turn back. On the return he launched into a discussion of will. It's the whole thing, he asserted. It's the one dividing line between good and evil. I've never met a man who led a rotten life and didn't have a weak will. How about great criminals? They're usually insane. If not, they're weak. There is no such thing as a strong, sane criminal. Byrne, I disagree with you altogether. How about the Superman? Well? He's evil, I think, yet he's strong and sane. I've never met him. I'll bet, though, that he's stupid or insane. I've met him over and over, and he's neither. That's why I think you're wrong. I'm sure I'm not, and so I don't believe in imprisonment except for the insane. On this point Amory could not agree. It seemed to him that life and history were rife with the strong criminal, keen but often self-deluding. In politics and business one found him, and among the old statesmen and kings and generals. But Byrne never agreed, and their courses began to split on that point. Byrne was drawing farther and farther away from the world about him. He resigned the vice-presidency of the senior class and took to reading and walking as almost his only pursuits. He voluntarily attended graduate lectures in philosophy and biology, and sat in all of them with a rather pathetically intent look in his eyes, as if waiting for something the lecturer would never quite come to. Sometimes Amory would see him squirm in his seat, and his face would light up. He was on fire to debate a point. He grew more abstracted on the street, and was even accused of becoming a snob. But Amory knew it was nothing of the sort, and once when Byrne passed him 4 feet off, absolutely unseeingly, his mind 1,000 miles away, Amory almost choked with the romantic joy of watching him. Byrne seemed to be climbing heights where others would be forever unable to get a foothold. "I tell you," Amory declared to Tom, "he's the first contemporary I've ever met whom I'll admit is my superior in mental capacity." "It's a bad time to admit it. People are beginning to think he's odd." "He's way over their heads. You know you think so yourself when you talk to him. Good Lord, Tom, you used to stand out against people. Success has completely conventionalized you." Tom grew rather annoyed. "What's he trying to do? Be excessively holy?" "No. Not like anybody you've ever seen. Never enters the Philadelphian Society. He has no faith in that rot. He doesn't believe that public swimming pools and a kind word in time will right the wrongs of the world. Moreover, he takes a drink whenever he feels like it." "He certainly is getting in wrong." "Have you talked to him lately?" "No." "Then you haven't any conception of him." The argument ended nowhere, but Amory noticed more than ever how the sentiment toward Byrne had changed on the campus. "It's odd," Amory said to Tom one night when they had grown more amicable on the subject, "that the people who violently disapprove of Byrne's radicalism are distinctly the Pharisee class. I mean they're the best educated men in college, the editors of the papers, like yourself and Ferrenby, the younger professors. The illiterate athletes like Langueduc think he's getting eccentric, but they just say, 'Good old Byrne has got some queer ideas in his head,' and pass on. The Pharisee class, gee, they ridicule him unmercifully." The next morning he met Byrne hurrying along McCosh Walk after a recitation. "Whither bound, sar?" "Over to the Prince office to see Ferrenby." He waved a copy of the morning's Princetonian at Amory. "He wrote this editorial." "Going to flay him alive?" "No, but he's got me all balled up. Either I've misjudged him or he's suddenly become the world's worst radical." Byrne hurried on, and it was several days before Amory heard an account of the ensuing conversation. Byrne had come into the editor's sanctum, displaying the paper cheerfully. "Hello, Jesse." "Hello there, Savonarola." "I just read your editorial." "Good boy. Didn't know you stooped that low." "Jesse, you startled me." "How so?" "Aren't you afraid the faculty'll get after you if you pull this irreligious stuff?" "What?" "Like this morning." "What the devil? That editorial was on the coaching system." "Yes, but that quotation." Jesse sat up. "What quotation?" "You know. 'He who is not with me is against me.'" "Well, what about it?" Jesse was puzzled, but not alarmed. "Well, you say here, let me see." Byrne opened the paper and read. "'He who is not with me is against me,' as that gentleman said who was notoriously capable of only coarse distinctions and puerile generalities." "What of it?" Ferrenby began to look alarmed. "Oliver Cromwell said it, didn't he? Or was it Washington, or one of the saints? Good Lord, I've forgotten." Byrne roared with laughter. "Oh, Jesse! Oh, good, kind Jesse!" "Who said it, for Pete's sake?" "Well," said Byrne, recovering his voice, "St. Matthew attributes it to Christ." "My God!" cried Jesse, and collapsed backward into the wastebasket. Amory writes a poem. The weeks tore by. Amory wandered occasionally to New York on the chance of finding a new shining green autobus, that its stick of candy glamour might penetrate his disposition. One day he ventured into a stock company revival of a play whose name was faintly familiar. The curtain rose. He watched casually as a girl entered. A few phrases rang in his ear and touched a faint chord of memory. Where? When? Then he seemed to hear a voice whispering beside him, a very soft, vibrant voice. "Oh, I'm such a poor little fool. Do tell me when I do wrong." The solution came in a flash, and he had a quick, glad memory of Isabel. He found a blank space on his programme and began to scribble rapidly. Here in the figured dark I watch once more. There with a curtain roll the years away. 2 years of years. There was an idle day of ours when happy endings didn't bore our unfermented souls. I could adore your eager face beside me, wide-eyed, gay, smiling a repertoire while the poor play reached me as a faint ripple reaches shore. Yawning and wondering an evening through, I watch alone, and chatterings, of course, spoil the one scene which somehow did have charms. You wept a bit, and I grew sad for you. Right here, where Mr. X defends divorce, and what's-her-name falls fainting in his arms. End of this part of Chapter 4. Book 1, Chapter 4, Part 2 of This Side of Paradise. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Book 1, Chapter 4, Part 2. Still Calm. "Ghosts are such dumb things," said Alec. "They're slow-witted. I can always outguess a ghost." "How?" asked Tom. "Well, it depends where. Take a bedroom, for example. If you use any discretion, a ghost can never get you in a bedroom." "Go on. Suppose you think there's maybe a ghost in your bedroom. What measures do you take on getting home at night?" demanded Amory, interested. "Take a stick," answered Alec with ponderous reverence, "one about the length of a broom handle. Now, the first thing to do is to get the room cleared. To do this you rush with your eyes closed into your study and turn on the lights. Next, approaching the closet, carefully run the stick in the door 3 or 4 times. Then, if nothing happens, you can look in. Always, always run the stick in viciously first. Never look first." "Of course, that's the ancient Celtic school," said Tom gravely. "Yes, but they usually pray first. Anyway, you use this method to clear the closets and also for behind all doors." "And the bed," Amory suggested. "Oh, Amory, no!" cried Alec in horror. "That isn't the way. The bed requires different tactics. Let the bed alone, as you value your reason. If there is a ghost in the room, and that's only about 1/3 of the time, it is almost always under the bed." "Well," Amory began. Alec waved him into silence. "Of course, you never look. You stand in the middle of the floor, and before he knows what you're going to do, make a sudden leap for the bed. Never walk near the bed. To a ghost your ankle is your most vulnerable part. Once in bed, you're safe. He may lie around under the bed all night, but you're safe as daylight. If you still have doubts, pull the blanket over your head." "All that's very interesting, Tom." "Isn't it?" Alec beamed proudly. "All my own, too. The Sir Oliver Lodge of the New World." Amory was enjoying college immensely again. The sense of going forward in a direct, determined line had come back. Youth was stirring and shaking out a few new feathers. He'd even stored enough surplus energy to sally into a new pose. "What's the idea of all this distracted stuff, Amory?" asked Alec one day, and then as Amory pretended to be cramped over his book in a daze. "Oh, don't try to act Byrne, the mystic, to me." Amory looked up innocently. "What?" "What?" mimicked Alec. "Are you trying to read yourself into a rhapsody with... Let's see the book." He snatched it, regarded it derisively. "Well?" asked Amory a little stiffly. "The Life of Saint Teresa," read Alec aloud. "Oh, my gosh!" "Say, Alec." "What?" "Does it bother you?" "Does what bother me?" "My acting dazed and all that?" "Why, no, of course it doesn't bother me." "Well, then, don't spoil it. If I enjoy going around telling people guilelessly that I think I'm a genius, let me do it." "You're getting a reputation for being eccentric," said Alec, laughing, "if that's what you mean." Amory finally prevailed, and Alec agreed to accept his face value in the presence of others if he was allowed rest periods when they were alone. So Amory ran it out at a great rate, bringing the most eccentric characters to dinner, wild-eyed grad students, preceptors with strange theories of God and government, to the cynical amazement of the supercilious cottage club. As February became slashed by sun and moved cheerfully into March, Amory went several times to spend week-ends with Monseigneur. Once he took Byrne, with great success, for he took equal pride and delight in displaying them to each other. Monseigneur took him several times to see Thornton Hancock, and once or twice to the house of a Mrs. Lawrence, a type of Rome-haunting American whom Amory liked immediately. Then one day came a letter from Monseigneur, which appended an interesting P.S. "Do you know," it ran, "that your third cousin, Clara Page, widowed 6 months and very poor, is living in Philadelphia? I don't think you've ever met her, but I wish, as a favor to me, you'd go to see her. To my mind she's rather a remarkable woman, and just about your age." Amory sighed and decided to go, as a favor. Clara. She was immemorial. Amory wasn't good enough for Clara, Clara of ripply golden hair, but then no man was. Her goodness was above the prosy morals of the husband-seeker, apart from the dull literature of female virtue. Sorrow lay lightly around her, and when Amory found her in Philadelphia, he thought her steely blue eyes held only happiness, a latent strength, a realism was brought to its fullest development by the facts that she was compelled to face. She was alone in the world, with 2 small children, little money, and, worst of all, a host of friends. He saw her that winter in Philadelphia entertaining a houseful of men for an evening, when he knew she had not a servant in the house except the little colored girl guarding the babies overhead. He saw one of the greatest libertines in that city, a man who was habitually drunk and notorious at home and abroad, sitting opposite her for an evening, discussing girls' boarding schools, with a sort of innocent excitement. What a twist Clara had to her mind! She could make fascinating and almost brilliant conversation out of the thinnest air that ever floated through a drawing-room. The idea that the girl was poverty-stricken had appealed to Amory's sense of situation. He arrived in Philadelphia, expecting to be told that 921 Ark Street was in a miserable lane of hovels. He was even disappointed when it had proved to be nothing of the sort. It was an old house that had been in her husband's family for years. An elderly aunt, who objected to having it sold, had put 10 years' taxes with a lawyer and pranced off to Honolulu, leaving Clara to struggle with the heating problem as best she could. So no wild-haired woman with a hungry baby at her breast and a sad Amelia-like look greeted him. Instead, Amory would have thought from his reception that she had not a care in the world. A calm virility and a dreamy humor, marked contrast to her level-headedness, into these moods she slipped sometimes as a refuge. She could do the most prosy things, though she was wise enough never to stultify herself with such household arts as knitting and embroidery, yet immediately afterward pick up a book and let her imagination rove as a formless cloud with the wind. Deepest of all in her personality was the golden radiance that she diffused around her. As an open fire in a dark room throws romance and pathos into the quiet faces at its edge, so she cast her lights and shadows around the rooms that held her, until she made of her prosy old uncle a man of quaint and meditative charm, metamorphosed the stray telegraph boy into a Puck-like creature of delightful originality. At first this quality of hers somehow irritated Amory. He considered his own uniqueness sufficient, and it rather embarrassed him when she tried to read new interests into him for the benefit of what other adorers were present. He felt as if a polite but insistent stage manager were attempting to make him give a new interpretation of a part he had conned for years. But Clara talking, Clara telling a slender tale of a hat-pin and an inebriated man and herself. People tried afterward to repeat her anecdotes, but for the life of them they could make them sound like nothing whatever. They gave her a sort of innocent attention, and the best smiles many of them had smiled for long. There were few tears in Clara, but people smiled misty-eyed at her. Very occasionally Amory stayed for little half-hours after the rest of the court had gone, and they would have bread and jam and tea late in the afternoon, or maple-sugar lunches, as she called them, at night. "You are remarkable, aren't you?" Amory was becoming trite from where he perched in the centre of the dining-room table, one 6 o'clock. "Not a bit," she answered. She was searching out napkins in the sideboard. "I'm really most humdrum and commonplace. One of those people who have no interest in anything but their children." "Tell that to somebody else," scoffed Amory. "You know you're perfectly effulgent." He asked her the one thing that he knew might embarrass her. It was the remark that the first boar made to Adam. "Tell me about yourself." And she gave the answer that Adam must have given. "There's nothing to tell." But eventually Adam probably told the boar all the things he thought about at night when the locusts sang in the sandy grass, and he must have remarked patronizingly how different he was from Eve, forgetting how different she was from him. At any rate, Clara told Amory much about herself that evening. She had had a harried life from 16 on, and her education had stopped suddenly with her leisure. Browsing in her library, Amory found a tattered grey book, out of which fell a yellow sheet that he impudently opened. It was a poem that she had written at school about a grey convent wall on a grey day, and a girl with her cloak blown by the wind sitting atop of it, and thinking about the many-coloured world. As a rule such sentiment bored him, but this was done with so much simplicity and atmosphere that it brought a picture of Clara to his mind, of Clara on such a cool grey day with her keen blue eyes staring out, trying to see her tragedies come marching over the gardens outside. He envied that poem. How he would have loved to have come along and seen her on the wall and talked nonsense or romance to her, perched above him in the air. He began to be frightfully jealous of everything about Clara, of her past, of her babies, of the men and women who flocked to drink deep of her cool kindness and rest their tired minds as at an absorbing play. "Nobody seems to bore you," he objected. "About half the world do," she admitted. "But I think that's a pretty good average, don't you?" And she turned to find something in Browning that bore on the subject. She was the only person he ever met who could look up passages and quotations to show him in the middle of the conversation, and yet not be irritating to distraction. She did it constantly with such a serious enthusiasm that he grew fond of watching her golden hair bent over a book, brow wrinkled ever so little at hunting her sentence. Through early March he took to going to Philadelphia for week-ends. Almost always there was someone else there, and she seemed not anxious to see him alone, for many occasions presented themselves when a word from her would have given him another delicious half-hour of adoration. But he fell gradually in love, and began to speculate wildly on marriage. Though this design flowed through his brain even to his lips, still he knew afterward that the desire had not been deeply rooted. Once he dreamt that it had come true and woke up in a cold panic, for in his dream she had been a silly flaxen Clara, with the gold gone out of her hair, and platitudes falling insipidly from her changeling tongue. But she was the first fine woman he ever knew, and one of the few good people who ever interested him. She made her goodness such an asset. Amory had decided that most good people either dragged theirs after them as a liability, or else distorted it to artificial geniality. And of course there were the ever-present prig and Pharisee, but Amory never included them as being among the saved. St. Cecilia. Over her grey and velvet dress, under her molten, beaten hair, colour of rose in mock distress flushes and fades and makes her fair, fills the air from her to him with light and languor and little sighs, just so subtly he scarcely knows, laughing lightning, colour of rose. Do you like me? Of course I do, said Clara seriously. Why? Well, we have some qualities in common, things that are spontaneous in each of us, or were originally. You're implying that I haven't used myself very well? Clara hesitated. Well, I can't judge. A man, of course, has to go through a lot more, and I've been sheltered. Oh, don't stall, please, Clara, Amory interrupted. But do talk about me a little, won't you? Surely, I'd adore to. She didn't smile. That's sweet of you. First answer some questions. Am I painfully conceited? Well, no, you have tremendous vanity, but it'll amuse the people who notice its preponderance. I see. You're really humble at heart. You sink to the third hell of depression when you think you've been slighted. In fact, you haven't much self-respect. Centre of target twice, Clara. How do you do it? You never let me say a word. Of course not. I can never judge a man while he's talking. But I'm not through. The reason you have so little real self-confidence, even though you gravely announce to the occasional Philistine that you think you're a genius, is that you've attributed all sorts of atrocious faults to yourself, and are trying to live up to them. For instance, you're always saying that you are a slave to highballs. But I am, potentially. And you say you're a weak character, that you've no will. Not a bit of will. I'm a slave to my emotions, to my likes, to my hatred of boredom, to most of my desires. You are not. She brought one little fist down onto the other. You're a slave, a bound, helpless slave to one thing in the world, your imagination. You certainly interest me. If this isn't boring you, go on. I notice that when you want to stay over an extra day from college, you go about it in a sure way. You never decide at first while the merits of going or staying are fairly clear in your mind. You let your imagination shinny on the side of your desires for a few hours, and then you decide. Naturally, your imagination, after a little freedom, thinks up a million reasons why you should stay, but your decision when it comes isn't true. It's biased. Yes, objected Amory, but it isn't lack of willpower to let my imagination shinny on the wrong side. My dear boy, there's your big mistake. This has nothing to do with willpower. That's a crazy, useless word. Anyway, you lacked judgment. The judgment to decide at once when you know your imagination will play you false, given half a chance. Well, I'll be darned! Exclaimed Amory in surprise. That's the last thing I expected. Clara didn't gloat. She changed the subject immediately. But she had started him thinking, and he believed she was partly right. He felt like a factory owner who, after accusing a clerk of dishonesty, finds that his own son, in the office, is changing the books once a week. His poor mistreated will that he had been holding up to the scorn of himself and his friends stood before him innocent, and his judgment walked off to prison with the unconfinable imp, imagination, dancing in mocking glee beside him. Clara's was the only advice he ever asked without dictating the answer himself, except, perhaps, in his talks with Monsignor Darcy. How he loved to do any sort of thing with Clara! Shopping with her was a rare Epicurean dream. In every store where she had ever traded she was whispered about as the beautiful Mrs. Page. "I bet she won't stay single long." "Well, don't scream it out. She ain't lookin' for no advice." "Ain't she beautiful?" Enter a floor walker. Silence till he moves forward, smirking. "Society person, ain't she?" "Yeah, but poor now, I guess, so they say." "Gee, girls, ain't she some kid?" And Clara beamed on all alike. Amory believed that trade people gave her discounts, sometimes to her knowledge and sometimes without it. He knew she dressed very well, had always the best of everything in the house, and was inevitably waited upon by the head floor walker at the very least. Sometimes they would go to church together on Sunday, and he would walk beside her and revel in her cheeks moist from the soft water in the new air. She was very devout, always had been, and God knows what heights she attained and what strength she drew down to herself when she knelt and bent her golden hair into the stained glass light. "Saint Cecilia!" he cried aloud one day, quite involuntarily, and the people turned and peered, and the priest paused in his sermon, and Clara and Amory turned to fiery red. That was the last Sunday they had, for he spoiled it all that night. He couldn't help it. They were walking through the March twilight where it was as warm as June, and the joy of youth filled his soul so that he felt he must speak. "I think," he said, and his voice trembled, "that if I lost faith in you, I'd lose faith in God." She looked at him with such a startled face that he asked her the matter. "Nothing," she said slowly. "Only this. 5 men have said that to me before, and it frightens me." "Oh, Clara, is that your fate?" She did not answer. "I suppose love to you is—" he began. She turned like a flash. "I have never been in love." They walked along, and he realized slowly how much she had told him. Never in love. She seemed suddenly a daughter of light alone. His entity dropped out of her plane, and he longed only to touch her dress, with almost the realization that Joseph must have had of Mary's eternal significance. But quite mechanically he heard himself saying, "And I love you. Any latent greatness that I've got is... Oh, I can't talk, but Clara, if I come back in 2 years in a position to marry you..." She shook her head. "No," she said. "I'd never marry again. I've got my 2 children, and I want myself for them. I like you. I like all clever men, you more than any. But you know me well enough to know that I'd never marry a clever man." She broke off suddenly. "Amory." "What?" "You're not in love with me. You never wanted to marry me, did you?" "It was the twilight," he said wonderingly. "I didn't feel as though I were speaking aloud. But I love you, or adore you, or worship you. There you go, running through your catalogue of emotions in 5 seconds." He smiled unwillingly. "Don't make me out such a lightweight, Clara. You are depressing sometimes." "You're not a lightweight of all things," she said intently, taking his arm and opening wide her eyes. He could see their kindliness in the fading dusk. "A lightweight is an eternal nay." "There's so much spring in the air, there's so much lazy sweetness in your heart." She dropped his arm. "You're all fine now, and I feel glorious. Give me a cigarette. You've never seen me smoke, have you? Well, I do, about once a month." And then that wonderful girl and Amory raced to the corner like 2 mad children gone wild with pale blue twilight. I'm going to the country for to-morrow," she announced, as she stood panting, safe beyond the flare of the corner lamp-post. "These days are too magnificent to miss, though perhaps I feel them more in the city." "Oh, Clara," Amory said, "what a devil you could have been if the Lord had just bent your soul a little the other way." "Maybe," she answered, "but I think not. I'm never really wild and never have been. That little outburst was pure spring." "And you are, too," said he. They were walking along now. "No, you're wrong again. How can a person of your own self-reputed brains be so constantly wrong about me? I'm the opposite of everything spring ever stood for. It's unfortunate, if I happen to look like what pleased some soppy old Greek sculptor, but I assure you that if it weren't for my face I'd be a quiet nun in the convent without—" Then she broke into a run, and her raised voice floated back to him as he followed, "My precious babies, which I must go back and see." She was the only girl he ever knew with whom he could understand how another man might be preferred. Often Amory met wives whom he had known as débutantes, and looking intently at them imagined that he found something in their faces which said, "Oh, if I could have only gotten you!" Oh, the enormous conceit of the man! But that night seemed a night of stars and singing, and Clara's bright soul still gleamed on the ways they had trod. "Golden, golden is the air," he chanted to the little pools of water. "Golden is the air, golden notes from golden mandolins, golden frets of golden violins, fair, oh, wearily fair. Skeins from braided basket, mortals may not hold. Oh, what strong, extravagant god who would know or ask it? Who could give such gold?" End of this part of chapter 4. Book 1, Chapter 4, Part 3 of This Side of Paradise. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Book 1, Chapter 4, Part 3. Amory is resentful. Slowly and inevitably, yet with a sudden surge at the last, while Amory talked and dreamed, war rolled swiftly up the beach and washed the sands where Princeton played. Every night the gymnasium echoed as platoon after platoon swept over the floor and shuffled out the basketball markings. When Amory went to Washington the next weekend he caught some of the spirit of crisis which changed to repulsion in the Pullman car coming back, for the berths across from him were occupied by stinking aliens, Greeks he guessed, or Russians. He thought how much easier patriotism had been to a homogeneous race, how much easier it would have been to fight as the colonies fought, or as the Confederacy fought. And he did no sleeping that night, but listened to the aliens guffaw and snore while they filled the car with the heavy scent of latest America. In Princeton everyone bantered in public and told themselves privately that their deaths at least would be heroic. The literary students read Rupert Brooke passionately. The lounge lizards worried over whether the government would permit the English-cut uniform for officers. A few of the hopelessly lazy wrote to the obscure branches of the War Department, seeking an easy commission and a soft berth. Then, after a week, Amory saw Byrne and knew at once that argument would be futile. Byrne had come out as a pacifist. The socialist magazines, a great smattering of Tolstoy, and his own intense longing for a cause that would bring out whatever strength lay in him, had finally decided him to preach peace as a subjective ideal. "When the German army entered Belgium," he began, "if the inhabitants had gone peaceably about their business, the German army would have been disorganized and—" "I know," Amory interrupted. I've heard it all. But I'm not going to talk propaganda with you. There's a chance that you're right. But even so, we're hundreds of years before the time when non-resistance can touch us as a reality. But Amory, listen. Burn, we just argue. Very well. Just one thing. I don't ask you to think of your family or friends, because I know they don't count a picayune with you beside your sense of duty. But, Byrne, how do you know that the magazines you read and the societies you join and these idealists you meet aren't just plain German? Some of them are, of course. How do you know they aren't all pro-German, just a lot of weak ones with German Jewish names? That's the chance, of course, he said slowly. How much or how little I'm taking this stand because of propaganda I've heard, I don't know. Naturally, I think that it's my most innermost conviction. It seems a path spread before me just now. Amory's heart sank. But think of the cheapness of it. No one's really going to martyr you for being a pacifist. It's just going to throw you in with the worst. I doubt it, he interrupted. Well, it all smells of Bohemian New York to me. I know what you mean, and that's why I'm not sure I'll agitate. You're one man, Byrne, going to talk to people who won't listen, with all God's given you. That's what Stephen must have thought many years ago. But he preached his sermon and they killed him. He probably thought as he was dying what a waste it all was. But you see, I've always felt that Stephen's death was the thing that occurred to Paul on the road to Damascus, and sent him to preach the word of Christ all over the world. Go on. That's all. This is my particular duty. Even if right now I'm just a pawn, just sacrificed. God, Amory, you don't think I like the Germans? Well, I can't say anything else. I get to the end of all the logic about non-resistance, and there, like an excluded middle, stands the huge spectre of a man as he is and always will be. And this spectre stands right beside the one logical necessity of Tolstoy's, and the other logical necessity of Nietzsche's. Amory broke off suddenly. When are you going? I'm going next week. I'll see you, of course. As he walked away, it seemed to Amory that the look in his face bore a great resemblance to that in Carey's when he had said good-bye under Blair Arch 2 years before. Amory wondered unhappily why he could never go into anything with the primal honesty of those two. Byrne's a fanatic, he said to Tom, and he's dead wrong, and I'm inclined to think just an unconscious pawn in the hands of anarchistic publishers and German-paid rag-wavers. But he haunts me, just leaving everything worth while. Byrne left in a quietly dramatic manner a week later. He sold all his possessions and came down to the room to say good-bye, with a battered old bicycle on which he intended to ride to his home in Pennsylvania. Peter the Hermit bidding farewell to Cardinal Richelieu, suggested Alec, who was lounging in the window-seat as Byrne and Amory shook hands. But Amory was not in a mood for that, and as he saw Byrne's long legs propel his ridiculous bicycle out of sight beyond Alexander Hall, he knew he was going to have a bad week. Not that he doubted the war. Germany stood for everything repugnant to him, for materialism and the direction of tremendous licentious force. It was just that Byrne's face stayed in his memory, and he was sick of the hysteria he was beginning to hear. What on earth is the use of suddenly running down Goethe? He declared to Alec and Tom. Why write books to prove he started the war, or that stupid overestimated Schiller is a demon in disguise? Have you read anything of theirs? Asked Tom shrewdly. No, Amory admitted. Neither have I, he said, laughing. People will shout, said Alec quietly. But Goethe's on his same old shelf in the library, to bore anyone that wants to read him. Amory subsided, and the subject dropped. What are you going to do, Amory? Infantry or aviation, I can't make up my mind. I hate mechanics, but then, of course, aviation's the thing for me." "I feel as Amory does," said Tom. "Infantry or aviation. Aviation sounds like the romantic side of the war, of course. Like cavalry used to be, you know. But like Amory, I don't know a horse power from a piston rod." Somehow Amory's dissatisfaction with his lack of enthusiasm culminated in an attempt to put the blame for the whole war on the ancestors of his generation, all the people who cheered for Germany in 1870, all the materialists rampant, all the idolizers of German science and efficiency. So he sat one day in an English lecture and heard Locksley Hall quoted and fell into a brown study with contempt for Tennyson and all he stood for he took him as a representative of the Victorians. "Victorians, Victorians, who never learned to weep, who sowed the bitter harvest that your children go to reap," scribbled Amory in his notebook. The lecturer was saying something about Tennyson's solidity, and 50 heads were bent to take notes. Amory turned over to a fresh page and began scrawling again. "They shuddered when they found what Mr. Darwin was about. They shuddered when the waltz came in and Newman hurried out." But the waltz came in much earlier. He crossed that out. "And entitled A Song in the Time of Order," came the professor's voice, droning far away. Time of order. Good Lord! Everything crammed in the box, and the Victorians sitting on the lid smiling serenely, with Browning in his Italian villa crying bravely, "All's for the best." Amory scribbled again. "You knelt up in the temple, and he bent to hear you pray. You thanked him for your glorious gains, reproached him for Cathay." Why could he never get more than a couplet at a time? Now he needed something to rhyme with "You would keep him straight with science, though he had gone wrong before." Well, anyway. "You met your children in your home. I fixed it up," you cried. Took your 50 years of Europe, and then virtuously died. "That was to a great extent Tennyson's idea," came the lecturer's voice. "Swinburne's Song in the Time of Order might well have been Tennyson's title. He idealized order against chaos, against waste." At last Amory had it. He turned over another page and scrawled vigorously for the 20 minutes that was left of the hour. Then he walked up to the desk and deposited a page torn out of his notebook. "Here's a poem to the Victorians, sir," he said coldly. The professor picked it up curiously while Amory backed rapidly through the door. Here is what he had written. "Songs in the time of order you left for us to sing. Proofs with excluded middles, answers to life in rhyme, keys of the prison warder and ancient bells to ring. Time was the end of riddles, we were the end of time. Here were domestic oceans and a sky that we might reach, guns and a guarded border, gauntlets but not to fling, thousands of old emotions and a platitude for each, songs in the time of order, and tongues that we might sing." The end of many things. Early April slipped by in a haze of long evenings on the club veranda with the gramophone playing Poor Butterfly inside. For Poor Butterfly had been the song of that last year. The war seemed scarcely to touch them, and it might have been one of the senior springs of the past, except for the drilling every other afternoon, yet Amory realized poignantly that this was the last spring under the old regime. "This is the great protest against the Superman," said Amory. "I suppose so," Alec agreed. "He's absolutely irreconcilable with any utopia. As long as he occurs, there's trouble and all the latent evil that makes a crowd list and sway when he talks. And of course all that he is a gifted man without a moral sense. That's all. I think the worst thing to contemplate is this. It's all happened before. How soon will it happen again? 50 years after Waterloo, Napoleon was as much a hero to English school children as Wellington. How do we know our grandchildren won't idealize von Hindenburg the same way? What brings it about? Time, damn it, and the historian. If we could only learn to look on evil as evil, whether it's clothed in filth or monotony or magnificence. God, haven't we raked the universe over the coals for 4 years? Then the night came that was to be the last. Tom and Amory, bound in the morning for different training camps, paced the shadowy walks as usual and seemed still to see around them the faces of the men they knew. The grass is full of ghosts tonight. The whole campus is alive with them. They paused by little and watched the moon rise, to make silver of the slate roof of Dodd and blue the rustling trees. "You know," whispered Tom, "what we feel now is the sense of all the gorgeous youth that has rioted through here in 200 years." A last burst of singing flooded up from Blair Arch, broken voices for some long parting. And what we leave here is more than this class. It's the whole heritage of youth. We're just one generation. We're breaking all the links that seem to bind us here to top-booted and high-stocked generations. We've walked arm in arm with Burr and Light Horse Harry Lee through half these deep blue nights. "That's what they are," Tom tangented off. "Deep blue. A bit of color would spoil them, make them exotic. Spires against a sky that's a promise of dawn, and blue light on the slate roofs. It hurts, rather." "Good-bye, Aaron Burr," Amory called toward deserted Nassau Hall. "You and I knew strange corners of life." His voice echoed in the stillness. "The torches are out," whispered Tom. "Ah, Messalina, the long shadows of building minarets on the stadium." For an instant the voices of freshman year surged around them, and then they looked at each other with faint tears in their eyes. "Damn! Damn!" The last light fades and drifts across the land. The low, long land, the sunny land of spires, the ghosts of evening tune against their lyres, and wander singing in a plaintive band down the long corridors of trees. Pale fires echo the night from tower top to tower. Oh, sleep that dreams, and dream that never tires, press from the petals of the lotus flower something of this to keep, the essence of an hour. No more to wait the twilight of the moon in this sequestered vale of star and spire, for one eternal morning of desire passes to time and earthly afternoon. Here, Heraclitus, did you find in fire and shifting things the prophecy you hurled down the dead years. This midnight my desire will see, shadowed among the embers, furled in flame, the splendor and the sadness of the world. Interlude. May 1917 to February 1919. A letter dated January 1918, written by Monsignor Darcy to Amory, who is a second lieutenant in the 171st Infantry, port of embarkation, Camp Mills, Long Island. My dear boy, all you need tell me of yourself is that you still are. For the rest I merely search back in a restive memory, a thermometer that records only fevers, and match you with what I was at your age. But men will chatter, and you and I will still shout our futilities to each other across the stage until the last silly curtain falls, plump upon our bobbing heads. But you are starting the spluttering magic lantern show of life with much the same array of slides as I had. So I need to write you if only to shriek the colossal stupidity of people. This is the end of one thing, for better or worse you will never again be quite the Amory Blaine that I knew. Never again will we meet as we have met, because your generation is growing hard, much harder than mine ever grew, nourished as they were on the stuff of the 90s. Amory, Lately I reread Aeschylus, and there in the divine irony of the Agamemnon I find the only answer to this bitter age. All the world tumbled about our ears, and the closest parallel ages back in that hopeless resignation. There are times when I think of the men out there as Roman legionaries, miles from their corrupt city, stemming back the hordes a little more menacing after all than the corrupt city, another blind blow at the race, furies that we passed with ovations years ago, over whose corpses we bleated triumphantly all through the Victorian era. And afterward an out-and-out materialistic world, and the Catholic Church. I wonder where you'll fit in. Of one thing I'm sure. Celtic you'll live, and Celtic you'll die. So if you don't use heaven as a continual referendum for your ideas, you'll find earth a continual recall to your ambitions. Amory, I've discovered suddenly that I'm an old man. Like all old men, I've had dreams sometimes, and I'm going to tell you of them. I've enjoyed imagining that you were my son, that perhaps when I was young I went into a state of coma and begat you, and when I came to, had no recollection of it. It's the paternal instinct, Amory. Celibacy goes deeper than the flesh. Sometimes I think that the explanation of our deep resemblance is some common ancestor, and I find that the only blood that the Darcys and the O'Haras have in common is that of the O'Donohues. Stephen was his name, I think. When the lightning strikes one of us, it strikes both. You had hardly arrived at the port of embarkation when I got my papers to start for Rome, and I am waiting every moment to be told where to take ship. Even before you get this letter, I shall be on the ocean. Then will come your turn. You went to war as a gentleman should, just as you went to school and college, because it was the thing to do. It's better to leave the blustering and tremulo heroism to the middle classes. They do it so much better. Do you remember that weekend last March when you brought Burne Holiday from Princeton to see me? What a magnificent boy he is! It gave me a frightful shock afterward when you wrote that he thought me splendid. How could he be so deceived? Splendid is the one thing that neither you nor I are. We are many other things. We're extraordinary. We're clever. We could be said, I suppose, to be brilliant. We can attract people. We can make atmosphere. We can almost lose our Celtic souls and Celtic subtleties. We can almost always have our own way. But splendid, rather not. I am going to Rome with a wonderful dossier and letters of introduction that cover every capital in Europe, and there will be no small stir when I get there. How I wish you were with me! This sounds like a rather cynical paragraph, not at all the sort of thing that a middle-aged clergyman should write to a youth about to depart for the war. The only excuse is that the middle-aged clergyman is talking to himself. There are deep things in us, and you know what they are as well as I do. We have great faith, though yours at present is uncrystallized. We have a terrible honesty that all our sophistry cannot destroy, and above all, a childlike simplicity that keeps us from ever being really malicious. I have written a keen for you, which follows. I'm sorry your cheeks are not up to the description I have written of them, but you will smoke and read all night. At any rate, here it is. A lament for a foster son, and he going to the war against the king of foreign. O Cone, he is gone from me, the son of my mind, and he in his golden youth like Angus Oje, Angus of the bright birds, and his mind strong and subtle like the mind of Cuchulain on Weirtherne. A Whereas through. His brow is as white as the milk of the cows of Maeve, and his cheeks like the cherries of the tree, and it bending down to Mary, and she feeding the Son of God. A Viliachrone. His hair is like the golden collar of the kings at Tara, and his eyes like the 4 grey seas of Erin, and they swept with the mists of rain. Mavrone Gokudyo. He is to be in the joyful and red battle, against the chieftains, and they doing great deeds of valour. His life to go from him, it is the cords of my own soul would be loosed. Avishtilich. My heart is in the heart of my son, and my life is in his life surely. A man can be twice young, in the life of his sons only. Hia Dufaha Alanav. May the Son of God be above him and beneath him, before him and behind him. May the King of the Elements cast a mist over the eyes of the King of Foreign. May the Queen of the Graces lead him by the hand, the way he can go through the midst of his enemies, and they not seeing him. May Patrick of the Gael and Colum of the churches, and the 5,000 saints of Erin be better than a shield to him, and he got into the fight. Och hochone. Amory, Amory, I feel, somehow, that this is all. One or both of us is not going to last out this war. I've been trying to tell you how much this reincarnation of myself in you has meant in the last few years. Curiously alike we are, curiously unlike. Goodbye, dear boy, and God be with you. Signed, Thayer Darcy. Embarking at night. Amory moved forward on the deck until he found a stool under an electric light. He searched in his pocket for notebook and pencil, and then began to write, slowly, laboriously. We leave tonight. Silent, we filled the still, deserted street, a column of dim grey, and ghosts rose startled at the muffled beat along the moonless way. The shadowy shipyards echoed to the feet that turned from night and day. And so we linger on the windless decks, see on the spectre shore, shades of 1,000 days, poor grey-ribbed wrecks. Oh, shall we then deplore those futile years? See how the sea is white. The clouds have broken and the heavens burn, to hollow highways paved with gravelled light. The churning of the waves about the stern rises to one voluminous nocturne. We leave tonight. A letter from Amory, headed Brest, March 11th, 1919, to Lieutenant T.P. Donvilliers, Camp Gordon, Georgia. Dear Baudelaire, we meet in Manhattan on the 30th of this very month. We then proceed to take a very sporty apartment, you and I and Alec, who is at me elbow as I write. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I have a vague dream of going into politics. Why is it that the pick of the young Englishmen from Oxford and Cambridge go into politics, and in the USA we leave it to the muckers? Raised in the ward, educated in the Assembly, and sent to Congress, fat-paunched bundles of corruption, devoid of both ideas and ideals, as the debaters used to say. Even 40 years ago we had good men in politics, but we are brought up to pile up $1 million and show what we are made of. Sometimes I wish I'd been an Englishman. American life is so damned dumb and stupid and healthy. Since poor Beatrice died, I'll probably have a little money, but very darn little. I can forgive Mother almost everything except the fact that in a sudden burst of religiosity toward the end, she left half of what remained to be spent in stained-glass windows and seminary endowments. Mr. Barton, my lawyer, writes me that my thousands are mostly in street railways, and that the said street railways are losing money because of the 5-cent fares. Imagine a salary list that gives $350 a month to a man that can't read and write. Yet I believe in it, even though I've seen what was once a sizable fortune melt away between speculation, extravagance, the democratic administration, and the income tax. Modern. That's me all over, Mabel. At any rate, we'll have really knockout rooms. You can get a job on some fashion magazine, and Alec can go into the Zinc Company or whatever it is that his people own. He's looking over my shoulder, and he says it's a brass company, but I don't think it matters much, do you? There's probably as much corruption in zinc made money as brass made money. As for the well-known Amory, he would write immortal literature if he were sure enough about anything to risk telling anyone else about it. There is no more dangerous gift to posterity than a few cleverly turned platitudes. Tom, why don't you become a Catholic? Of course, to be a good one you'd have to give up those violent intrigues you used to tell me about. But you'd write better poetry if you were linked up to tall golden candlesticks and long even chants, and even if the American priests are rather bourgeois, as Beatrice used to say, still you need only go to the sporty churches, and I'll introduce you to Monsieur Darcy, who really is a wonder. Carrie's death was a blow. So was Jessie's to a certain extent, and I have a great curiosity to know what queer corner of the world has swallowed Byrne. Do you suppose he's in prison under some false name? I confess that the war, instead of making me orthodox, which is the correct reaction, has made me a passionate agnostic. The Catholic Church has had its wings clipped so often lately that its part was timidly negligible, and they haven't any good writers any more. I'm sick of Chesterton. I've only discovered one soldier who passed through the much advertised spiritual crisis, like this fellow Donald Hankey, and the one I knew was already studying for the ministry, so he was ripe for it. I honestly think that's all pretty much rot, though it seemed to give sentimental comfort to those at home, and may make fathers and mothers appreciate their children. This crisis-inspired religion is rather valueless and fleeting at best. I think 4 men have discovered Paris to 1 that discovered God. But us, you and me and Alec, oh, we'll get a Jap butler and dress for dinner and have wine on the table, and lead a contemplative, emotionless life until we decide to use machine guns with the property owners, or throw bombs with the Bolshevik God. Tom, I hope something happens. I'm restless as the devil, and I have a horror of getting fat or falling in love and growing domestic. The place at Lake Geneva is now for rent, but when I land I'm going west to see Mr. Barton and get some details. Write me care of the Blackstone, Chicago. So ever, dear Boswell, signed Samuel Johnson. End of chapter. Book 2, Chapter 1 of This Side of Paradise. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Book 2, The Education of a Personage. Chapter 1, The Debutante. The time is February. The place is a large dainty bedroom in the Connage House on 68th Street, New York. A girl's room. Pink walls and curtains, and a pink bedspread on a cream-colored bed. Pink and cream are the motifs of the room, but the only article of furniture in full view is a luxurious dressing-table with a glass top and a 3-sided mirror. On the walls there is an expensive print of Cherry Ripe, a few polite dogs by Landseer, and the King of the Black Isles by Maxfield Parrish. Great disorder consisting of the following items. 1. 7 or 8 empty cardboard boxes, with tissue-paper tongues hanging panting from their mouths. 2. An assortment of street dresses mingled with their sisters of the evening, all upon the table, all evidently new. 3. A roll of tulle, which has lost its dignity and wound itself tortuously around everything in sight. And 4. Upon the 2 small chairs, a collection of lingerie that beggars description. One would enjoy seeing the bill called forth by the finery displayed, and one is possessed by a desire to see the princess for whose benefit. Look! There's someone. Disappointment. This is only a maid hunting for something. She lifts a heap from a chair. Not there. Another heap. The dressing-table. The chiffonier drawers. She brings to light several beautiful chemises and an amazing pyjama, but this does not satisfy her. She goes out. An indistinguishable mumble from the next room. Now we are getting warm. This is Alec's mother, Mrs. Connage, ample, dignified, rouged to the dowager point and quite worn out. Her lips move significantly as she looks for it. Her search is less thorough than the maid's, but there is a touch of fury in it that quite makes up for its sketchiness. She stumbles on the tool, and her "damn" is quite audible. She retires, empty-handed. More chatter outside, and a girl's voice, a very spoiled voice, says, "Of all the stupid people—" After a pause, a third seeker enters, not she of the spoiled voice, but a younger edition. This is Cecilia Connage, 16, pretty, shrewd, and constitutionally good-humoured. She is dressed for the evening in a gown, the obvious simplicity of which probably bores her. She goes to the nearest pile, selects a small pink garment, and holds it up appraisingly. Cecilia. Pink? Rosalind, outside. Yes. Cecilia. Very snappy? Rosalind. Yes. Cecilia. I've got it. She sees herself in the mirror of the dressing-table and commences to shimmy enthusiastically. Rosalind, outside. What are you doing? Trying it on? Cecilia ceases and goes out, carrying the garment at the right shoulder. From the other door enters Alec Connage. He looks around quickly and in a huge voice shouts, "Mama!" There is a chorus of protest from next door, and encouraged he starts toward it, but is repelled by another chorus. Alec. So that's where you all are. Amory Blaine is here. Cecilia, quickly. Take him downstairs. Alec. Oh, he is downstairs. Mrs. Connage. Well, you can show him where his room is. Tell him I'm sorry that I can't meet him now. Alec. He's heard a lot about you all. I wish you'd hurry. Father's telling him all about the war, and he's restless. He's sort of temperamental. This last suffices to draw Cecilia into the room. Cecilia, seating herself high upon lingerie. How do you mean, temperamental? You used to say that about him in letters. Alec. Oh, he writes stuff. Cecilia. Does he play the piano? Alec. Don't think so. Cecilia, speculatively. Drink? Alec. Yes, nothing queer about him. Cecilia. Money? Alec. Good Lord! Ask him. He used to have a lot, and he's got some income now. Mrs. Connage appears. Mrs. Connage. Alec, of course we're glad to have any friend of yours. Alec. You certainly ought to meet Amory. Mrs. Connage. Of course I want to, but I think it's so childish of you to leave a perfectly good home to go and live with 2 other boys in some impossible apartment. I hope it isn't in order that you all drink as much as you want. She pauses. He'll be a little neglected tonight. This is Rosalind's week, you see. When a girl comes out, she needs all the attention. Rosalind, outside. Well, then, prove it by coming here and hooking me. Mrs. Connage goes. Alec. Rosalind hasn't changed a bit. Cecilia, in a lower tone. She's awfully spoiled. Alec. She'll meet her match tonight. Cecilia. Who? Mr. Amory Blaine? Alec nods. Cecilia. Well, Rosalind has still to meet the man she can't outdistance. Honestly, Alec, she treats men terribly. She abuses them and cuts them, and breaks dates with them, and yawns in their faces, and they come back for more. Alec. They love it. Cecilia. They hate it. She's a sort of vampire, I think, and she can make girls do what she wants usually. Only she hates girls. Alec. Personality runs in our family. Cecilia, resignedly. I guess it ran out before it got to me. Alec. Does Rosalind behave herself? Cecilia. Not particularly well. Oh, she's average. Smokes sometimes. Drinks punch. Frequently kissed. Oh, yes, common knowledge. One of the effects of the war, you know. Emerges Mrs. Connage. Mrs. Connage. Rosalind's almost finished, and I can go down and meet your friend. Alec and his mother go out. Rosalind outside. Oh, Mother! Cecilia. Mother's gone down. And now Rosalind enters. Rosalind is utterly Rosalind. She is one of those girls who need never make the slightest effort to have men fall in love with them. Two types of men seldom do. Dull men are usually afraid of her cleverness, and intellectual men are usually afraid of her beauty. All others are hers by natural prerogative. If Rosalind could be spoiled, the process would have been complete by this time, and as a matter of fact, her disposition is not all it should be. She wants what she wants when she wants it, and she is prone to make every one around her pretty miserable when she doesn't get it. But in the true sense, she is not spoiled. Her fresh enthusiasm, her will to grow and learn, her endless faith in the inexhaustibility of romance, her courage and fundamental honesty, these things are not spoiled. There are long periods when she cordially loathes her whole family. She is quite unprincipled. Her philosophy is carpe diem for herself and laissez-faire for others. She loves shocking stories. She has that coarse streak that usually goes with natures that are both fine and big. She wants people to like her, but if they do not it never worries her or changes her. She is by no means a model character. The education of all beautiful women is the knowledge of men. Rosalind has been disappointed in man after man as individuals, but she had great faith in man as a sex. Women she detested. They represented qualities that she felt and despised in herself: incipient meanness, conceit, cowardice, and petty dishonesty. She once told a roomful of her mother's friends that the only excuse for women was the necessity for a disturbing element among men. She danced exceptionally well, drew cleverly but hastily, and had a startling facility with words, which she used only in love letters. But all criticism of Rosalind ends in her beauty. There was that shade of glorious yellow hair, the desire to imitate which supports the dye industry. There was the eternal kissable mouth, small, slightly sensual, and utterly disturbing. There were grey eyes and an unimpeachable skin with 2 spots of vanishing colour. She was slender and athletic, without underdevelopment, and it was a delight to watch her move about a room, walk along a street, swing a golf club, or turn a cartwheel. A last qualification: her vivid, instant personality escaped that conscious, theatrical quality that Amory had found in Isabel. Monsignor Darcy would have been quite up a tree whether to call her a personality or a personage. She was perhaps the delicious, inexpressible, once-in-a-century blend. On the night of her debut she is, for all her strange, stray wisdom, quite like a happy little girl. Her mother's maid has just done her hair, but she has decided impatiently that she can do a better job herself. She is too nervous just now to stay in one place. To that we owe her presence in this littered room. She is going to speak. Isabel's alto tones have been like a violin. But if you could hear Rosalind, you would say her voice was musical as a waterfall. Rosalind. Honestly, there are only 2 costumes in the world that I really enjoy being in. Combing her hair at the dressing-table. One's a hoop skirt with pantaloons, the other's a one-piece bathing suit. I'm quite charming in both of them. Cecilia. Glad you're coming out? Rosalind. Yes, aren't you? Cecilia, cynically. You're glad so you can get married and live on Long Island with the fast younger married set. You want life to be a chain of flirtation with a man for every link. Rosalind. Want it to be one? You mean I've found it one. Cecilia. Ha! Rosalind. Cecilia, darling, you don't know what a trial it is to be
Like me. I've got to keep my face like steel in the street to keep men from winking at me. If I laugh hard from a front row in the theatre, the comedian plays to me for the rest of the evening. If I drop my voice, my eyes, my handkerchief at a dance, my partner calls me up on the phone every day for a week. Cecilia. It must be an awful strain. Rosalind. The unfortunate part is that the only men who interest me at all are the totally ineligible ones. Now, if I were poor, I'd go on the stage. Cecilia. Yes, you might as well get paid for the amount of acting you do. Rosalind. Sometimes when I felt particularly radiant I've thought, why should this be wasted on one man? Cecilia. Often when you're particularly sulky, I've wondered why it should all be wasted on just one family. Getting up. I think I'll go down and meet Mr. Amory Blaine. I like temperamental men. Rosalind. There aren't any. Men don't know how to be really angry or really happy, and the ones that do go to pieces. Cecilia. Well, I'm glad I don't have all your worries. I'm engaged. Rosalind, with a scornful smile. Engaged? Why, you little lunatic! If Mother heard you talking like that, she'd send you off to boarding school, where you belong. Cecilia. You won't tell her, though, because I know things I could tell, and you're too selfish. Rosalind, a little annoyed. Run along, little girl. Who are you engaged to? The iceman? The man that keeps the candy store? Cecilia. Cheap wit. Good-bye, darling. I'll see you later. Rosalind. Oh, be sure and do that. You're such a help. Exit Cecilia. Rosalind finished her hair and rises, humming. She goes up to the mirror and starts to dance in front of it on the soft carpet. She watches not her feet, but her eyes, never casually, but always intently, even when she smiles. The door suddenly opens and then slams behind Amory, very cool and handsome as usual. He melts into instant confusion. He. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought... She, smiling radiantly. Oh, you're Amory Blaine, aren't you? He, regarding her closely. And you're Rosalind. She. I'm going to call you Amory. Oh, come in. It's all right. Mother'll be right in. Under her breath. Unfortunately. He, gazing around. This is sort of a new wrinkle for me. She. This is no man's land. He. This is where you... Pause. She. Yes, all those things. She crosses to the bureau. See, here's my rouge, eye pencils. He. I didn't know you were that way. She. What did you expect? He. I thought you'd be sort of sexless. You know, swim and play golf. She. Oh, I do, but not in business hours. He. Business? She. 6 to 2, strictly. He. I'd like to have some stock in the corporation. She. Oh, it's not a corporation. It's just Rosalind Unlimited. 51 shares, name, goodwill, and everything goes at $25,000 a year. He, disapprovingly. Sort of a chilly proposition. She. Well, Amory, you don't mind, do you? When I meet a man that doesn't bore me to death after 2 weeks, perhaps it'll be different. He. Odd, you have the same point of view on men that I have on women. She. I'm not really feminine, you know, in my mind. He, interested. Go on. She. No, you go on. You've made me talk about myself. That's against the rules. He. Rules? She. My own rules. But you. Oh, Amory, I hear you're brilliant. The family expects so much of you. He. How encouraging. She. Alex said you'd taught him to think. Did you? I didn't believe anyone could. He. No, I'm really quite dull. He evidently doesn't intend this to be taken seriously. She. Liar. He. I'm religious. I'm literary. I've even written poems. She. Vers libre. Splendid. She declaims. The trees are green. The birds are singing in the trees. The girl sips her poison. The bird flies away. The girl dies. He, laughing. No, not that kind. She, suddenly. I like you. He. Don't. She. Modest, too. He. I'm afraid of you. I'm always afraid of a girl until I've kissed her. She, emphatically. My dear boy, the war is over. He. So I'll always be afraid of you. She, rather sadly. I suppose you will. A slight hesitation on both their parts. He, after due consideration. Listen, this is a frightful thing to ask. She, knowing what's coming. After 5 minutes. He. But will you? Kiss me? Or are you afraid? She. I'm never afraid, but your reasons are so poor. He. Rosalind, I really want to kiss you. She. So do I. They kiss, definitely and thoroughly. He, after a breathless second. Well, is your curiosity satisfied? She. Is yours? He. No, it's only aroused. He looks it. She, dreamily. I've kissed dozens of men. I suppose I'll kiss dozens more. He, abstractedly. Yes, I suppose you could, like that. She. Most people like the way I kiss. He, remembering himself. Good Lord, yes! Kiss me once more, Rosalind. She. No, my curiosity is generally satisfied at one. He, discouraged. Is that a rule? She. I make rules to fit the cases. He. You and I are somewhat alike, except that I'm years older in experience. She. How old are you? He. Almost 23. You? She. 19. Just. He. I suppose you're the product of a fashionable school. She. No, I'm fairly raw material. I was expelled from Spence. I've forgotten why. He. What's your general trend? She. Oh, I'm bright, quite selfish, emotional when aroused, fond of admiration. He, suddenly. I don't want to fall in love with you. She, raising her eyebrows. Nobody asked you to. He, continuing coldly. But I probably will. I love your mouth. She. Hush! Please don't fall in love with my mouth. Hair, eyes, shoulders, slippers, but not my mouth. Everybody falls in love with my mouth. He. It's quite beautiful. She. It's too small. He. No, it isn't. Let's see. He kisses her again with the same thoroughness. She, rather moved. Say something sweet. He, frightened. Lord help me. She, drawing away. Well, don't, if it's so hard. He. Shall we pretend? So soon? She. We haven't the same standards of time as other people. He. Already it's other people. She. Let's pretend. He. No, I can't. It's sentiment. She. You're not sentimental.
He. No, I'm romantic. A sentimental person thinks things will last. A romantic person hopes against hope that they won't. Sentiment is emotional.
She. And you're not? With her eyes half closed. You probably flatter yourself that that's a superior attitude.
He. Well, Rosalind, don't argue. Kiss me again.
She, quite chilly now. No, I have no desire to kiss you.
He, openly taken aback. You wanted to kiss me a minute ago.
She. This is now.
He. I'd better go.
She. I suppose so. He goes toward the door. She. Oh!
He turns. She, laughing.
Score. Home team 100. Opponents 0. He starts back. She, quickly. Rain. No game. He goes out. She goes quietly to the chiffonier, takes out a cigarette case and hides it in the side drawer of a desk. Her mother enters, notebook in hand. Mrs. Connage. Good. I've been wanting to speak to you alone before we go downstairs. Rosalind. Heavens, you frighten me. Mrs. Connage. Rosalind, you've been a very expensive proposition. Rosalind, resignedly. Yes. Mrs. Connage. And you know your father hasn't what he once had. Rosalind, making a wry face. Oh, please don't talk about money. Mrs. Connage. You can't do anything without it. This is our last year in this house, and unless things change, Cecilia won't have the advantages you've had. Rosalind, impatiently. Well, what is it? Mrs. Connage. So I ask you to please mind me and several things I've put down in my notebook. The first one is, don't disappear with young men. There may be a time when it's valuable, but at present I want you on the dance floor where I can find you. There are certain men I want to have you meet, and I don't like finding you in some corner of the conservatory exchanging silliness with anyone, or listening to it. Rosalind, sarcastically. Yes, listening to it is better. Mrs. Connage. And don't waste a lot of time with the college set. Little boys 19 and 20 years old. I don't mind a prom or a football game, but staying away from advantageous parties to eat in little cafes downtown with Tom, Dick, and Harry. Rosalind, offering her code, which is in its way quite as high as her mother's. Mother, it's done. You can't run everything now the way you did in the early 90s. Mrs. Connage, paying no attention. There are several bachelor friends of your father's that I want you to meet tonight. Youngish men. Rosalind, nodding wisely. About 45? Mrs. Connage, sharply. Why not? Rosalind. Oh, quite all right. They know life and are so adorably tired-looking. Shakes her head. But they will dance. Mrs. Connage. I haven't met Mr. Blaine, but I don't think you'll care for him. He doesn't sound like a money-maker. Rosalind. Mother, I never think about money. Mrs. Connage. You never keep it long enough to think about it. Rosalind sighs. Yes, I suppose some day I'll marry a ton of it, out of sheer boredom. Mrs. Connage, referring to notebook. I had a wire from Hartford. Dawson Ryder is coming up. Now there's a young man I like, and he's floating in money. It seems to me that since you seem tired of Howard Gillespie, you might give Mr. Ryder some encouragement. This is the 3rd time he's been up in a month. Rosalind. How did you know I was tired of Howard Gillespie? Mrs. Connage. The poor boy looks so miserable every time he comes. Rosalind. That was one of those romantic pre-battled affairs. They're all wrong. Mrs. Connage, her say said. At any rate, make us proud of you tonight. Rosalind. Don't you think I'm beautiful? Mrs. Connage. You know you are. From downstairs is heard the moan of a violin being tuned, the roll of a drum. Mrs. Connage turns quickly to her daughter. Mrs. Connage. Come. Rosalind. 1 minute. Her mother leaves. Rosalind goes to the glass, where she gazes at herself with great satisfaction. She kisses her hand and touches her mirrored mouth with it. Then she turns out the lights and leaves the room. Silence for a moment. A few chords from the piano, the discreet patter of faint drums, the rustle of new silk, all blend on the staircase outside and drift in through the partly opened door. Bundled figures pass in the lighted hall. The laughter heard below becomes doubled and multiplied. Then someone comes in, closes the door, and switches on the lights. It is Cecilia. She goes to the chiffonier, looks in the drawers, hesitates. Then to the desk whence she takes the cigarette case and extracts one. She lights it and then, puffing and blowing, walks toward the mirror. Cecilia, in tremendously sophisticated accents. Oh, yes. Coming out is such a farce nowadays, you know. One really plays around so much before one is 17 that it's positively anticlimax. Shaking hands with a visionary middle-aged nobleman. Yes, your grace, I believe I've heard my sister speak of you. Have a puff. They're very good. They're Coronas. You don't smoke? What a pity! The king doesn't allow it, I suppose. Yes, I'll dance. So she dances around the room to a tune from downstairs, her arms outstretched to an imaginary partner, the cigarette waving in her hand. End of this part of Chapter 1.